Hello everyone, welcome back to class. This is the fourth module of the Scrum Master training, and in this fourth module, module 4, the fourth module, we would be looking at best practices in Scrum. Best practices in Scrum. I believe we have about 9 of them, if I'm not mistaken. Without wasting much time, let's jump right into it. And this fourth module would be the final module in the training on the Scrum Master role. So let's be attentive and jump right into it. So these are the best practices, or sometimes regarded as Scrum patterns, that we often make reference to in Scrum. Yes, 8 of them. 8 of them. The first one is interrupt buffer. So in this class, in this first lesson, we would be looking at the interrupt buffer. That is module 4, lesson 1, the interrupt buffer. Let's jump right into it. But before we do that, quickly, these patterns in Scrum had made Scrum to stand out from other frameworks of Agile. But there are quite a few of these patterns that we could see in other Agile frameworks also, called different names. Some of them we would mention to you as we go further. So let's jump right into module 4, lesson 1, which is the interrupt buffer. Let's take a look at this picture before we dig deeper into it, in the interrupt buffer. When we look here, we will see this gentleman with the bat in his hand, right? As if someone is throwing a ball, like a lawn tennis ball, to him. And it has an inscription here called the PO, the product owner. So this ball in the hand of this particular individual is a work item. A work item. And this individual could be said as a stakeholder. The individual could be said as a stakeholder. So what happens? Interrupt buffer is a planned allocation of team capacity set aside to absorb unexpected work or interruptions that arise during a sprint. I would explain that to us. The concept recognizes that while a sprint scope is intended to be fixed once it starts, real-world scenarios often throw up unforeseen tasks that cannot be ignored until the next sprint. So let's cast our minds back to what happens in Scrum. A team has a product backlog that they are working from, and from the product backlog they decide to pick some of those work to be worked on in a sprint. They pick some of those work to be worked on in a sprint, and this is what we have from the board here, right? They selected a few from the product backlog into the sprint backlog, and that happens during the sprint planning. That happens during the sprint planning. The sprint planning event. Right? So the team decides what they would work on based on the team capacity. But what often happens is that in the course of the sprint, stakeholders come up and request for additional work, and sometimes those additional work could be urgent, could be quite important, and they want it done now. In actual sense, they can't wait until the end of the sprint or the next sprint cycle before the team starts to work on that piece of work. So the team needs to accommodate that piece of work. So what a smart team does, or sometimes the Scrum Master could introduce to the team, is to profile a buffer. And a buffer is a placeholder from the team's total capacity to be reserved for unforeseen urgent task coming in. So as that unforeseen urgent tasks are coming in, you can see this work item is in green. So when it came in, because it is urgent, due now, we have provided some availability in the course of the sprint to accommodate that piece of work. The ones that are not urgent would go into the product backlog, but these ones that could be urgent would be accommodated in the course of the sprint. So the question is, let's assume, we mentioned that during sprint planning, we plan based on the team's velocity. Let's say a team's velocity is to accommodate 100 story points, right? In a sprint, 100 story points. Let's now assume that from the entire 100 story points, the team had filled up all the 100 story points and they do not have capacity to accommodate anymore. Then suddenly the stakeholders sent across that we need an urgent work to be done. As a PO, yes, you want to negotiate, you want to look at the impact on the team and all the rest. But when leadership comes to say this is urgent, for instance, let's assume that your team works on the website and one of the features you are working on or you've worked on that you've delivered is the payment platform of that website. You are now working on other important features. Suddenly, in day 2 or day 3 of your sprints, there is a bug that is making payments platform not to be effective. Payments could not be concluded, and that needs to be urgently fixed. Would you say, oh, I'm sorry, we don't have capacity to work on it in the course of the sprint, we need to wait until the end of this sprint, which could be in another 2 weeks? No, you wouldn't. You need to accommodate that particular piece of work. So that is where the interrupt buffer comes in. Some team would have or for you to effectively use interrupt buffer, the team would have reserved some capacity of their total availability in the course of the sprint to accommodate for buffer. So we could conclude that from every 100% we have, we are reserving 15% as our buffer, right? So we would load up the remaining 85% with work and leave 15% empty to accommodate an urgent work. More particularly when we realize that that team often receive such requests. I would go through some of those requests that could come. I've mentioned one. You just find out that the payment platform is not working, right? So the team needs to would have reserved some percentage to accommodate for those. So the question I'm sure will be going through your mind now is, what happens if in the course of the sprint a team does not receive any urgent requests and they've reserved 15%? What happens to that 15%? Obviously, mind you, in the course of this training, we've spoken extensively about the backlog refinement, which prepares for future sprints. So in a case where the team does not receive any to fill that 15%, or they receive just a bit to fill that 15%, they will then go to future sprints as they are consuming the work they have here. By the time they finish these ones, they would go to the future sprints and bring some work item from the future sprint to fill up the buffer. That's the question number one. I've just answered that. So let's also now say the team reserves 15%, but the request that came as urgent is 25%. How would the team deal with it? In the same manner, the team, because this is urgent, mind you, underlined, urgent is something that needs to be attended to in the course of the sprint. The team would now look at the sprint backlog. For them to bring in 25, that means from the 85, 10% needs to go back to the product backlog. So they will look at which story is least in priority that would amount to the remaining 10%, and whichever story that amounts to 10% that is least in priority will be taken back to the product backlog to accommodate the entire 25% into the sprint. So that is how the interrupt buffer works. There is need for us to understand what the capacity allocation is, which is what I've just explained. Instead of allocating the entire 100% to the team, they would reserve some percentage to work to accommodate the interruptions. Then secondly, there are different types of interruptions, as I've mentioned earlier. It could be a critical bug fix, like in the illustration that I mentioned, where they realized that payments could not be made on the platform. And of course, if payments could not be made, that means no fund is coming into business. So it becomes a critical bug that needs to be fixed. It could be support work or any other high priority issue that requires immediate attention. So the team would have prepared beforehand the size of their buffer, what the size of the buffer is. That would have mostly been done at the sprint planning meeting or the sprint planning event before the sprint planning is concluded. So that is how interrupt buffer is made in Scrum. So let's go to the next slide and see some of the considerations we have for interrupt buffer. Some of them I've mentioned in the explanation I made earlier. So number one is to understand the need for a buffer, which is what I've explained. We need to understand the need for a buffer. You don't use the buffer anyhow. You need to know what the need is. Where a team does not have interruptions, then you don't need interrupt buffer. So interrupt buffer is to accommodate for various distractions that come in the way of the team, and those distractions are urgent matter to be worked on. There's a similar practice. This is out of the scope of this training, but I will mention it for your knowing. There's a similar practice in Kanban also, Kanban framework, which we call expedite lane. It is used also to accommodate urgent work. It works in a similar way as the interrupt buffer. Then, of course, the size of the buffer, just as I mentioned, is it 10%? Is it 15%? There is no rule of thumb per se for what your interrupt buffer could be. It is just a team thing for you to know how much of interruptions do you have sprint in, sprint out. More particularly, when your team is responsible for some work that has to do with support or services or fixing bugs, the rates of those interruptions will determine the size of the buffer. Then, of course, you need to set clear guidelines. Where clear guidelines come to play is that not all requests would jump on interrupt buffer. There are some, as we saw in that first slide, there are some that would go back to the product backlog. So not all requests would be accommodated on the interrupt buffer. Then, of course, you need to know what your communication channel would be with the stakeholders. You need to manage that properly. Then, as I've mentioned, your interrupt buffer should be accommodated, should be set during your sprint planning. That's the best time you would have prepared for the interrupt buffer. Then you need to continuously monitor and adjust as the interrupt buffer comes. Different interrupt buffers come. Then, of course, you need to prioritize those interruptions also. And lastly, you need to check the impact of these interruptions on your velocity. So as you are developing further, you will be checking the impact of the interruptions, and you are recalibrating your velocity time and time again. All right, so that will be where we'll stop this class. Module 4, lesson 1, looking at the interrupt buffer in Scrum. If you have any questions, please note them down and ship them across. I'll be glad to entertain them. We'll see you again in the next class. Bye for now.